Frustrated, angry, one word, pissed.
Pausing any non-critical construction projects, though we're hearing this morning that is looking less and less likely. Limits on non-essential manufacturing and warehouse businesses, including even limiting the hours under which these businesses could operate, Gurdeep. And also the province looking at prohibiting indoor weddings, funerals, and religious services, in addition to also fining any non-essential businesses who refuse to let their staff work from home if it is feasible for them to do so. Yesterday, we mentioned the fact that a curfew is also being discussed. It doesn't look like that's very likely this morning either. And that's something that the mayor tells CP24 that he actually didn't support one way or another. Here's what he told us.
I have said, over and over again that I'm not a big fan of it, mostly because I think the enforcement question becomes something that is, one that has to make you think as to how effective it's going to be. I mean, if you really enforce it, then you're into, I think, a way of life that most of us don't think is consistent with how we live here. If you don't enforce it, well, then what's the point? And in a way, the restrictions that we need, I think, to have people focus on are ones about their own activities during the day, not at night.
I have been providing updates to Ontarians for over a year now. And at some of the previous press conferences, I referred to the situation as worrisome and even scary. What is truly scary is that when I used those words before, our rates and our trends were nowhere near where we find ourselves. And it is likely we will see our daily cases remain high for the next while.
We've got the people going to these hotels. We've got people that are quarantining, yet there seem to be still, strangely enough, because you have to have a test before you get on the plane, and they're reporting, and I only base it on what I see on CP24 and what I hear in some of the reports we hear from public health. There are still people getting off planes with COVID-19. So you have to ask yourself, well, how's that system working? If you're supposed to get a test, you're required to get a test before you get on the plane, leave alone what happens to you when you get here. Then you get here after a flight that I'm assuming doesn't take days. It takes hours, and then you have COVID-19 when you get here.
Frustrated, angry, one word, pissed.
Marie is one of 10,000 people in an eastern Toronto neighborhood with a vaccine appointment cancelled.
The numbers are going up. You want us to be vaccinated, and you're running out of vaccine everywhere you go.
A number of sites forced to cancel bookings, including in hard-hit Scarborough.
It's really frustrating. There needed to be sort of a oversight and a redistribution of vaccine from the areas that are lower risk, have less COVID incidence, to the areas that are hardest hit.
Ontario's premier says delays from Moderna as well as AstraZeneca have caused a logistical nightmare.
It's not about pointing fingers at any level of government. As I said, the facts are we're short on the supply.
Alberta is faster to point fingers at Ottawa, responsible for procurement.
Jurisdictions around the world that produce no vaccines, starting with Israel, have now achieved effective immunity in their population.
Opposition parties on Parliament Hill piled on.
Other countries are reopening, Mr. Speaker. We're going back into lockdown.
There are zoo animals that are being vaccinated in the United States, while Quebec is reporting a wave of femicides because women are locked down with their abusers.
The Canadians are angry, and they want to know how the Prime Minister let things get so bad.
We recognize that things are getting very bad, particularly in Ontario, and that's why we are continuing to be there to support the Ford government.
Not fast enough to protect Madiha Khan's 67-year-old mother, whose appointment was cancelled.
Looking forward to it because it meant that she would get vaccinated, go back to school and work with the special needs unmasked kids, but protected.
Particularly frustrating for that family and others, reports of vaccines sitting in freezers. Distribution is a provincial responsibility. Here in Ontario, the province attributes those stored doses to a buffer public health units keep on hand in case of future delays. Officials would only say it's a few days' worth. But as the province tries to blame cancellations in hotspots on shortage issues, experts say that doesn't square with vaccines in freezers.
Looks can be deceiving. Amid a province-wide stay-at-home order, Ontario construction workers are still at it. The government sending inspectors to 1,300 such sites to ensure COVID compliance.
Let me start, as we usually do, with the key findings. So COVID-19 cases, hospitalization, and ICU occupancy are at their highest levels since March 2020, and variant cases continue to rise sharply. And when we talk about high levels of ICU occupancy, we're almost 700 today, and over 70 admissions yesterday. This level of ICU occupancy is compromising care for all patients, for all Ontarians who may need it. Ontarians can help themselves and others by limiting mobility to truly necessary trips and always wearing a mask and keeping 6 feet distance when in contact with anyone outside of their household. Although it's improving, vaccination is not reaching people at high risk fast enough to overcome the level of serious illness in our communities and our hospitals. And without stronger system-level measures and immediate support for essential workers and high-risk communities, high case rates will persist into the summer and perhaps through it. Let's turn to the first chart, which shows the rate of growth of cases across public health units in Ontario. You can see in virtually all of our public health units now, there has been substantial growth in the number of cases over the last 2 weeks. You can see that it has come down in a small number of public health units. This is largely due to strong public health measures being in place. And you can see as well here, I hope, that many of these increases over just 2 weeks are doubling of case rates. Test positivity rates are also increasing across Ontario. You can see here that the test positivity rate when we calculated it earlier this week was 8% for the entire province. Both the case rate and the test positivity rate are above the level that we used to call red or control, which gives us a sense of where we are as a province, that most of our communities are now in that level that we would be instituting very significant restrictions. And continuing, Ontario testing rates are flat. The increase in cases is because there are more cases, not more tests being done. When we see a stable level of testing, an increase in cases, and an increase in positivity, this tells us that this is a real increase in cases, and in this case, a substantial and sharp, essentially exponential growth in cases that we see in the province. Now, throughout the pandemic, we've talked a lot about the reproduction number. This is really a reflection of how many people are infected by every person who has a case. The higher the reproduction number, the more people who are infected. We talked about the greater transmissibility of the new variants of concern, the variants that were originally discovered in the United Kingdom, in Brazil, or in South Africa, and we've known that these were more transmissible. As you can see here, the reproduction rate for the variants of concern, which is in the left-hand panel in the orange chart, is well above 1. That's a sign of exponential growth. That means that cases are going to continue to grow substantially and rapidly for a while. But what's important is to note the right-hand side as well. The right-hand side in blue is the reproduction number for the earlier strains, for the wild-type variants, for the ones that were first identified in Wuhan in China. And you can see here that this reproduction number is also now over 1. So we're seeing a growth in the variants of concern that is dramatic and sharp. We're also now seeing growth in the earlier variants, which means that we are not really at the point yet of controlling the disease through the public health measures. Continuing on, this chart shows you the growth in hospitalization since the beginning of September last year and the growth in ICU occupancy. If you look over at the far left-hand side of the chart, you'll see that hospitalizations and ICU occupancy were very low in that lull period during the summer. This is a function of people completing their care, of people dying, of a variety of issues, but really we're able to empty out our intensive care units after the first wave. You can see in the second wave, the wave that really builds throughout November and December of last year and into the big bit of January, you can see that dramatic growth in hospitalizations that is accompanied a little bit later by a growth in ICU occupancy. But what's different now about the second wave, or what's different now about the third wave compared to the second wave, is that our ICUs, our intensive care units, never had the chance to empty out again. And so as we hit this third wave, as ICU occupancy rises, and remember the new variants of concern are not only more transmissible, they're also more dangerous. They are more likely to result in hospitalization. They are more likely to result in intensive care unit admission, and they are more likely to result in death. We're now filling up our intensive care units on top of what was still there. following the second wave. And this is one of the reasons that we are in such jeopardy with our intensive care units. Let me turn now to the modeling, the projections of where we're going to be in the next little while with the pandemic. Once again, this is not one model that we're running here. This is 4 groups of scientists running different models with many, many scenarios. What we've tried to do here is consider what our likely trajectory would have been about 2 or 3 weeks ago, before the start of the public health measures. That's the red line. The yellow line here gives us a sense of where we would be with our current, or the ones that were announced most recently in terms of public health measures. That's kind of the moderate or the midline case. And then also what we would look like with stronger public health measures, perhaps more similar to the level of reduction in mobility that we saw at the beginning of the pandemic in April last year. And that's the green line. And you can see here as well a couple of other assumptions and variables that we tried to deal with. First, we're assuming here on all of these models 100,000 doses of vaccine a day. That's roughly where we are right now. We're also assuming about a 60% effectiveness in terms of stopping transmission, not in terms of reduction of mortality, not in terms of reduction of hospitalization. Those are higher percentages that we use in the models, but here, percent effective in reducing infection. And we're assuming it's a relatively random administration of the vaccine. The other thing that we consider in all these is how long the public health measures last. The solid lines are for 4 weeks, and the dotted lines are for 6 weeks. As you can see here, had we not instituted the public health measures, the models are suggesting that we would have had a much, much higher rate of case growth, to an almost unbelievable level of perhaps 30,000 before it would peak and come down. What the models are suggesting now, looking at where we are more likely, which is the yellow line, is that the case growth is going to be much less substantial. And if public health measures extend for 6 weeks instead of 4 weeks, we really blunt the second round of growth as part of this wave. You can also see with stronger public health measures and a longer, that dotted green line, a longer period for them, for 6 weeks, we actually would get down to a much, much, much lower level of cases, much similar to what we would have seen during lulls between the waves, rather than what we're seeing now. I also want to note here that we've been looking at the briefings from previous weeks. The red box here indicates the range that we anticipated in the last briefing. And all of the models are in line with what we would have predicted in the last time. Before I move on to the next set of notes, I do want to note that the goal here is to flatten the curve as much as possible, to push that curve down. Every time we hit one of those milestones where we're starting to control growth, where we're starting to flatten the curve, that's a cause for celebration. That's an indication that we're getting closer to a more normal summer. It's a goal I think that everyone can kind of work towards, and we actually are able to see our progress almost on a daily basis of whether or not we are or not flattening this curve. If we go to the next scenario, I know that there's a lot of attention on vaccination. We took a moment to consider what it would look like if we had about 3 times as many vaccines being administered on a daily basis in the province that we have right now. So although we are not administering 300,000 vaccines a day right now, we did consider what would happen if we started administering 300,000 vaccines a day today, Friday. You can see, I think, a couple of interesting things here. Even under the weak scenario, that earlier scenario that we're no longer on that trajectory, that red scenario, it brings the peak down, it shifts the peak to slightly earlier, and it brings down overall the total number of cases. If you look then at that top yellow line, that top dotted yellow line, that's the moderate public health measures. That's where we think we're at right now in terms of the effectiveness of our current bundle of measures. That top line is a 6-week imposition of those measures. If we had 300,000 vaccines a day, starting today, you'd see that line drop further, and you'd see a lower peak and an earlier peak. And it keeps on coming down quite nicely. And if you look at green, which is the stronger set of public health measures, again, with the assumption that we did have 300,000 vaccines, which we don't have right now a day to administer, that peak is earlier, lower, and the whole curve gets lower. So public health measures make a significant difference and have already made a significant difference in what we would see in this pandemic. Longer public health measures help really tamp down that curve and make sure that we get the cases under control. And more vaccines, if possible, actually add significantly to both the help significantly with the duration of this wave and the overall trajectory in the long run. Let me talk about what these different models now go back. I think we've lost our slides. If we can, thank you. Let's go back now to the ICU projections. So here again, we're assuming 100,000 doses of vaccine a day. We're assuming that patients are following normal protocols and entering intensive care units when they need the care. We're at about 690 patients in ICUs today. We had about 74 admissions to ICU yesterday. You can see that we're really growing at a very steep pace right here, right now with our intensive care unit occupancy. And we're starting to get to that very sharp part of the curve where growth is significant. Under any of the scenarios, I want to point out right now, under any of the scenarios, growth keeps on for the next 2 weeks. Whatever we have right now in terms of cases is really baked in terms of what happens to our intensive care units over the next 2 weeks. But you can see, if you look at the insert, that stronger and longer public health measures do help push down the overall target that we could hit. But over the next 2 weeks, it's likely that we will exceed 800 patients in intensive care units. That is well above the old threshold that we discussed of about 300. We are on track over the next 2 or 3 weeks to actually hit almost 1,000 patients in intensive care units. And unless we're able to break that, we could actually see higher and higher levels. Now, it's not clear that all those patients would ever be able to enter an intensive care unit bed, even with the heroic efforts going on across the province to increase capacity right now. There may just not be the ability to put them into these types of beds. And not only that, there may not be the ability to put other types of patients into beds who require intensive care. So we are right now at a very significant point of growth in intensive care unit occupancy. Let me talk now a little bit about what's driving this growth in intensive care unit occupancy, what's driving the growth in cases, what's driving the growth in hospitalizations. This slide describes mobility. We'll go through 2 slides on mobility. This is really based on publicly available cell phone data. We're able to understand when people are outside or a good distance away from their home. You can see here that following the public health measures around the winter holiday, you can see there's a substantial drop in mobility and it stays low for a while. This is really the result of first, people staying home around the holidays, but as importantly, the public health measures, and although they persisted for a while and were frustrating and challenging, you can see that they helped tamp down the level of mobility substantially and really brought it below a mobility threshold, that dotted line there, which is necessary to prevent spread of the pandemic. You can see, though, as public health measures have relaxed, that mobility has increased again substantially. And anyone who is looking at one of our major streets here in Toronto or commuting back and forth from work on one of our major highways is probably able to see that increase in mobility very easily. And although it is starting to come down now with the new public health measures, you can see that curve coming down on the far right-hand side. It's not down far enough to control the spread of the pandemic. On this next slide, you can see we've decomposed some of this change in mobility to look at places where people are often indoors, workplaces, retail and recreation, and transit. And you can see basically the same pattern again repeated. A drop around the holidays, followed by an increase, and then eventually an increase above a level that's really necessary to sustain control of the pandemic. And then just the start now as well of it coming back down, which hopefully indicates that the public health measures are starting to work. But we're not yet at that level of mobility at this point in time that would allow us to really control spread. There is other mobility data, but we're focusing on indoors here because that is where the majority of spread happens, is indoors. Continuing on, you can see the impact on the health system continues. We're now at a backlog of surgical cases of almost 250,000 since the start of the pandemic last March. That is a huge volume of care that is delayed or postponed. With the slowdown in care that you're seeing now at hospitals across the province, this is going to increase. And we expect that rate of increase will actually be faster and more dramatic despite efforts to try to maintain access to care. Looking here now, we can turn to vaccine progress, and this is where we have some good news in what's going on. The strategy is about a quarter of the way through. In fact, it's more than the 24% through that we're presenting here. This was calculated a few days ago, and it's actually increasing now over time. If you look at the far left-hand side of the panel, that's the bar or the part of the bar chart for older people. This is over 80, and you can see that it's almost blue, which is people who've either had a first dose or made an appointment for their first dose. And there's only a small bit of yellow left, which is people who've not received their first dose. Moving to 70 to 79, you can see again it's a substantial number. The vast majority of people have received a first dose or are booked now for their first dose. But when we get to 60 to 69, you can see that actually it's only about half have either received their first dose or been booked for it. And then looking over at the right-hand side, you can see under 60, younger people in the province, this is a substantially lower amount of vaccine that's been provided and taken. Moving on, you can see here the same chart as we presented last week. In this chart, it's worth just taking a second to kind of work through it. We're comparing neighborhoods by how high the rate of COVID-19 is. So 1, that far left-hand side column, 1 is the highest risk neighborhoods. 10, the far right-hand side of the column, is the lowest risk neighborhoods. The first row is the oldest group of Ontarians we're looking at here, which is over 80 years of age. The bottom row is 16 to 39 years of age. You can see that we actually had a very, very large discrepancy between the lowest risk neighborhoods and the highest risk neighborhoods when we presented last time. This has started to narrow. However, it's important to note that still it is 82% of people in the lowest risk neighborhoods who've received a vaccine. It's only 65% of people in the highest risk neighborhoods who've received a vaccine. And so that is a difference that needs to be closed, and actually we would hope to see more people in the highest risk neighborhoods having received a vaccine. The picture actually is improving though. That's a smaller disparity than in the past. And as we start to move down into younger age groups, you start to see the type of difference that we'd like to see. Say, for instance, in the age group of 70 to 74 years of age, 57% of people in the highest risk neighborhoods have received the vaccine. 39% of people in the lowest risk neighborhood have started to have received the vaccine. And so that's the sort of difference that we want that will really help control the spread of the virus in the highest risk neighborhoods. That picture continues on for a while through some of the middle age groups, but you can see as we get into younger age groups again, that disparity emerges again. For instance, in age 16 to 39 years, 5% of people in the highest risk neighborhoods have received a vaccine, whereas 10% of people in the lowest risk neighborhoods have received a vaccine. And so it's important to keep on correcting that level of disparity. Now, moving on to our last slide of results. If we took about half of our vaccine and we focused it into these highest risk neighborhoods, it pays a substantial dividend in terms of control over the pandemic. And so we're considering here a vaccination strategy that is at about our current level, at about 100,000 vaccinations a day. We're thinking about putting about 50% of vaccines into the 20% highest risk neighborhoods. And you can see that it actually provides a substantial improvement in control over cases compared to allocation of vaccines based on age and population size alone. And if you'd like to think about the number of vaccines you need to give to stop or avert a case of COVID-19, if we just do an age-based allocation across the province, it takes about 60 vaccines to avert a case. And instead, if you really focus it in with about half those vaccines in the highest risk communities, it takes about 30 to 35 vaccines to avoid a case. And so a very, very big return if we're able to continue on with this focus of vaccines, as is indicated in the phase 2 of the strategy, focus in on high-risk communities as much as we can. I'll finish here with our key findings, as we always do. If maybe we could return to the slides. Thank you. COVID-19 cases, hospitalizations, and ICU occupancy are higher than they've ever been before. ICU occupancy is compromising care for all patients. Ontarians can help themselves and others by limiting mobility to truly necessary trips, always wearing a mask, always staying 6 feet distant from anyone who's outside their household. Vaccination is improving, both in its rate, or its volume, and in terms of its focus on the areas where it'll do the greatest good. But we're not moving fast enough yet to overcome the level of serious illness in those communities, and that is in our hospitals now. And without stronger system-level measures and immediate support for essential workers in high-risk communities, these case rates will persist. I'm moving on here to the contributors. These are the scientists and experts from across the province who've contributed to the material in this briefing. And I could spend a lot of time just calling out their volunteer work here.